history department, worked mostly on Chinese economic and environmental history. And what Michael asked me to do were two somewhat separate things, which is one sort of quick and dirty intro to demography, and then a second part that's about China and sustainability. So let me start with the demography, some of which I suspect will be elementary to a lot of you, but maybe not to all of you. So if it's too elementary, stop and scream. And if, which I think is less likely, it's not elementary enough, stop and scream. But the basic demographic facts are probably familiar to you, but they're still a good place to start. Human population is about 6.8 billion now, and it's quadrupled in the 20th century. And to put that in perspective, that's about how much it had increased in the previous 1,800 years. And in fact, it doubled just in the last 40 years of this century. And this led a lot of people to worry that what we were looking at was an exponential growth curve that was just headed for disaster. But growth has been slowing down significantly in percentage terms since about 1970. And most people now predict a leveling off between 2050 and 2100. And the level at which it will level off, depending on who you listen to, varies from about 9 billion to 12 billion. Handful of people still.
And what are we at right now?
6.8.
Okay.
So we have, if you think we're headed for the high end, we have almost one doubling left. If you think we're headed for flattening off at 9, then we have much less than that. And most people now think that the curve looks like a logistic curve. And if this was working, I would show you a nice picture of the logistic curve. But anyway, one of the few really serious exceptions to this is a guy named Joel Cohen at Rockefeller University, who thinks we are still basically on an exponential growth curve, and that we're going to at least 14 billion in the coming century, and who knows what beyond that. The exact shape and ceiling, though, even if we agree that it's a logistic curve, and they look like S's for those of you who don't know, will flatten at the top, is still unclear. And of course, there's a big difference between flattening off at 9 billion versus flattening off at 12 billion. The other big change to track, I think, if you're thinking at the purely global level, is the changing age structure of the population. In 1950, 8% of humans were 60 years old or older. By 2050, that figure is going to be about 23%. So we're looking at a very dramatic change in the percentage of people who, for the most part, will not be productive members in the sense of making stuff. The term for what's been playing out over the last century or so, and will probably play out by late in this one, is what's called the demographic transition. And that's a term that has an agreed upon meaning, but it's been refined over time in several important details. The core idea is simple. The core idea is once upon a time, populations grew slowly in most societies because though they had high birth rates due to absence of any effective contraception, they also had high death rates due to poor nutrition and medical care. Then the story went, nutrition and sanitation began to improve in the countries that first experienced industrialization, and death rates fell dramatically. Significant advances in medical care came along several decades later and accelerated the process. Cool. All right. Thank you. So this is world population growth, 10,000 BC to the present. You get a sense. Sure looks like an exponential curve. If we then, the hope is that it looks like, in the long run, like a logistic curve. Oh, come on. This worked yesterday. But let's not worry about it. Anyway. And this is the Joel Cohen scenario. This is what the UN calls the middle estimate, flattening off at, it's hard to see, but that's about 9 billion, actually about 10 billion. And this is the low estimate, which actually starts to decline fairly significantly around 2070. Okay, so the story goes, improvements in health and sanitation come along, death rates fall dramatically. But since birth rates didn't fall, at least at first, population begins to grow very rapidly. Eventually, however, the same general forces that had unleashed very rapid population growth begin to bring down birth rates. People move into cities where children are an economic burden rather than being an asset the way they are on a non-mechanized farm. They stop fearing child mortality so much, so they don't think they need lots of kids in order to ensure that one or two survive. And they begin to aspire for jobs, jobs both for themselves and offspring, that require education, so they start breeding later, especially once women start aspiring to jobs that require education. And they want to invest more in each child, which intensified the logic of having fewer. And then, again, according to the standard story, then along come first factories and then pharmaceutical companies, which fill that need for people to have fewer children by beginning to make reliable contraceptives. And so, lo and behold, people can act on their desire for fewer children without denying themselves sex. Birth rates start to fall until prosperous societies reach a new sort of equilibrium in which population grows slowly, if at all, because the death and birth rates are now both low. So that's the demographic transition from high birth rate, high death rate, therefore equilibrium, to low birth rate, low death rate, therefore equilibrium. In poorer parts of the world, however, death rates started to fall before indigenous industrialization, because the technologies of modern public health and medicine could be imported from elsewhere before widespread economic growth and mass urbanization had taken off. So you got lower death rates without birth rates falling, and the fastest population growth ever. So for much of the third world in the second half of the 20th century, population grew between 2% and 3% per year. To put that in perspective, Germany, which had the fastest population growth in Europe during industrialization, growth rates never got above 1% per year for more than very, very short periods. So the late 20th century is a big, big deal. But since the late 60s, birth rates have started to fall rapidly in poorer countries too, sometimes through the same dynamic that drove the process in the North Atlantic: urbanization, more education, delayed marriage, and sometimes in other ways. And the completion of the demographic transition now seems to be in sight in most countries, though it's still as much as a couple generations away in a few places. Okay. Now, at a general, coarse-grained level of analysis, this is a pretty good story, and demographers have lived off it for the last 75 years or so. And about half the world's population now lives in countries that have basically gone through the process: Europe, Russia, North America, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and now China as well. But there are at least three critical things to remember that are asterisks to this story. First, that still leaves about half the world that hasn't gone through the demographic transition. And though we can see it starting to happen, how fast it happens is going to make a huge difference. That's what's going to determine whether we level off at 9 billion or at 12 billion, whatever. Secondly, despite general agreement on the outlines of the story I just gave you, there's a lot of disagreement on the weight of particular factors in any one of these cases. One of the concepts that demographers loved was something called natural fertility, which was the idea that before modern contraception came along, people simply had no way to regulate their fertility. So, they were like non-human animals, and we can make certain inferences about their probable growth rates, blah, blah, blah. Turns out, though, that contrary to that assumption, most pre-industrial societies did have ways of varying effectiveness for limiting births. And these often unraveled during the social changes that came with early industrialization, so that birth rates actually rose at the same time that death rates were starting to fall. To give just one example, if you look at much of Western Europe, the rise of industry is accompanied by the rise of wage labor, right? So instead of waiting to inherit mom and dad's farm or shop or whatever, You could go out and earn a living with your muscles without having to control any means of production of your own. This is not what's supposed to happen here. Let's go. Did we lose this? One of the things that meant is that young people could defy their parents. Parents could say, we don't want you to get married yet. Once you could earn your living on your own at age 17, you could say, I'm going to do it myself. And in fact, age at first marriage does start to drop very significantly with the rise of wage labor, therefore earlier marriages, therefore the woman is at risk of pregnancy for a longer period of time, therefore higher birth rates. To give a more recent example, in Bangladesh, among a number of other places, both urbanization and what people thought were progressive social reforms broke up extended families. And as they did, adults became less confident that they could count on their nephews and nieces in their old age if they had no children of their own. So consequently, they became more intent than ever on making sure that they had at least one child survive to adulthood. Birth rates actually rose. So basically, there's no such thing as natural fertility, or at least it's extremely rare, and variations in indigenous social structure mean that the same thing can have two very different effects in very different places. So, in Western Europe, as I just said, the growth of wage labor meant you could easily ignore your parents' wishes and marry younger. When industrialization comes to Southeast China, on the other hand, it comes to a place where the age at first marriage for girls is already something like 17. It can't get any younger. In fact, what the ability to defy your parents does there is it gives young women the ability to resist an arranged marriage. And so the same thing that increased the birth rate in England decreases it in South China. So the basic point is, we kind of know how certain pieces, which pieces are likely to affect other pieces, but we don't always know the direction of the relationships, which is what makes forecasting the result of any particular policy change very country-specific, and therefore a real pain. When we get to declining fertility, there also seem to be huge differences in how much difference particular factors made in any particular place. So some places, female education seems to have an enormous effect. Other places, very little. Same thing goes for the making condoms available, for socioeconomic changes that make children more expensive, so on and so forth. And that again means that it's very, very hard to predict what a given policy change will do. The most spectacular example of this is China, which began in the late 70s to adopt a very aggressive approach, imposing serious legal penalties for having more than one child in the cities or more than two in the countryside, for having your child earlier than you were allowed to, et cetera, et cetera. And the birth rate did indeed fall spectacularly. The current estimate is that China's population will peak at about 1.5 billion, whereas at least one projection back in the 80s was that if they didn't institute fertility control, population would go to 2.3 billion. So if that guess was that a question?
No.
Okay.
Sorry.
If that question was right, if that estimate was right, then the policy reduced population by 800 million people. So that's 2 USAs plus a Pakistan and a France. That's an awful lot of people. But the costs in human rights, in aborted girls, because parents who could only have one child often wanted to make sure it was a boy, and so forth, were very large. And then the kicker, because the gains start to look a lot smaller if you change the assumptions about what would have happened otherwise. So the government has now revised its estimate down by saying that, oh, well, without this policy, population would have leveled off at 1.8 billion instead of 2.3. So still a pretty big difference, but less than half of what they originally said. And now, obviously, your estimates of how much this mattered depend on your counterfactual of what would have happened otherwise. Well, here's one counterfactual you can come up with by comparing China to a whole bunch of other countries. And as you can see, the Chinese fertility rate falls much faster than this sample of lots of other countries. This supports the notion that, hey, this made a big, big difference. Though you will also notice that the fertility rate actually starts to fall fast before the full policy kicks in about here. So something was happening well before. But now take a look at this. This is China side by side with Thailand. Thailand used no coercion at all in its birth control policy. It's basically one eccentric multimillionaire who made it his life's work to make birth control available. Right? If you treat that as your counterfactual, then suddenly this was all for nothing. Now, it would pretty clearly be irresponsible to assume that every country was going to follow the Thai curve when we have those other curves to look at. But it gives you an idea how much of this stuff is really up for grabs and how little certainty we have when we actually get to policy. Yeah.
In general, are the more developed countries, do they want to encourage the less developed countries to have fewer kids?
Yes and no. Certainly an awful lot of money from the late 50s until quite recently has gone into various kinds of population education, making contraceptives available, et cetera, et cetera. So from that perspective, yes, the rich countries have done a lot. They haven't always known exactly what they were doing, and sometimes they've done it in ways that were very counterproductive. And particularly in cases where foreigners either deliberately or accidentally got involved with government-backed population control policies that were highly coercive, it really tended to delegitimize those policies because it could really look like, these white foreigners are coming in and trying to reduce the number of brown, yellow, black, whatever babies. And there are a few things that are going to erode support for something faster than that. If you want an utterly, I would say even beyond skeptical, scathing account of this, there's a book by a guy named Matt Connolly called Imperfect Conceptions, which is a history of the global population control movement based mostly on the archives of the UN and the Rockefeller Foundation. And he concludes that it has all been a total mess. That it has had very little positive effect and been brutally coercive. I think he overdoes it, but there's a case to be made, certainly in some countries, that measures have been unproductive or even counterproductive. In terms of the impact on sustainability, it obviously matters whether the world peaks at closer to 9 billion or 12 billion. But it's equally true, and this is something that people in poorer countries often point to when they're angry about the forms that population control has taken, that on a global scale, even a difference of that size probably matters less to total human impacts than changes in the level of consumption per capita. Right? So the average American, for instance, uses 45 times as much energy per year as the average Bangladeshi. So, if that continues to be the case, then even a fairly modest decline in energy uses of 300 million Americans would make room for an awful lot of Bangladeshis at their current level of energy consumption. Similarly, a pound of protein from grain-fed American beef takes anywhere from 8 to 20 times as much energy to produce as a pound of vegetable protein, and anywhere from 50 to 200 times as much water. So again, at a global level, changing diets are likely to actually make a bigger difference than changing numbers of people. Of course, the challenge here is that it's much more likely that Bangladeshis are going to want to consume like Americans, then Americans are going to decide, oh, it would be fine to consume at the level of Bangladeshis. Chinese meat consumption, for instance, has more than tripled since their boom began in the 80s. So while prosperity does tend to eventually reduce population growth, so far we haven't found any way to avoid that prosperity.
Sorry,
Yeah.
so is that because people want to be like Americans, or is that because people see a different lifestyle and they like to consume more?
I mean, I don't think people necessarily want to be like Americans,
Well, I mean, just like...
but people do tend to want more stuff. Now, how much that has to do with a global advertising industry, right, which reaches middle-class kids in Bangladesh and says, hey, you want to be like your peers in London and New York, and then in turn a local advertising industry that reaches the kids in the countryside and says, you want to be like your peers in the Bangladeshi cities, and how much it's just natural for people to want more stuff, is pretty complicated. But it is true that so far, we haven't found a whole lot of people on a mass scale saying, gee, I'd be happy with less. I don't think, it's also true, there's actually now a whole field, which I think is somewhat dubious. There's a whole field of so-called happiness research, where they do surveys of how content people are. And the correlation between material prosperity and happiness is actually very poor. So Japanese are actually among the least happy people in the world, according to these surveys, and Nicaraguans are extremely happy. So you could make a case, if you believe this stuff, that, hey, we should be preaching to the world, stuff doesn't make you happy. So far, at least, we haven't had a whole lot of luck convincing people of that. And again, I think the Chinese example, where they've tripled their meat consumption since the per capita meat consumption since the early 80s, is kind of alarming, right? Because it's certainly not that Chinese cuisine is lacking in tasty alternatives to meat-based dishes. But give them more money and they seem to want to use a chunk of it in that way. Beyond the questions that appear when you think about global population and resource demand figures, a whole bunch of other issues linked to sustainability appear when you start to think in smaller units and see how the varied scenarios look by region. And I want to emphasize two things here. The first is that you actually have some countries where native-born population is falling pretty sharply. Much of Europe, Russia, Japan, and the urban part of China, which has 600 million people, so it would be a pretty big country if it were on its own. There's actually no precedent for this happening in modern societies in peacetime. The last dip in global population was in the mid-1600s, and it was a pretty small dip. The last substantial decline in large populations in peacetime was the plague in the 1300s. So we don't really know how this is going to play out. One thing it does mean, which is already happening in some of these places, is that there's going to be huge amounts of migration to places that are relatively prosperous, have relatively elderly populations that need services, and smaller numbers of young people. Now, when we tend to think about migration, we tend to think that today's migration rates are unprecedented, right? You often hear about the borderless world, blah, blah, blah. In fact, they aren't. The percentage of world population that lives outside its country of birth is almost exactly the same as it was in 1913, which when you think about it is pretty stunning, right? Costs of travel have fallen like a rock. Income differentials between the richest and poorest countries have grown, which should increase the incentive to migrate, so on and so forth. The truth is that, for better or worse, government restrictions on movement are a lot more effective than we often think. It's not a borderless world if you're Mexican. And it's really, really not a borderless world if you're Burmese. You have both your own government trying to keep you from moving out and other countries trying to keep you from moving in. But a good guess is that the scale of transnational migration will become unprecedented soon because of these demographic differentials that I was talking about. And that's going to have huge implications for healthcare systems, possibly for social conflict, and maybe even for political security in some cases. If you think people, or some people, are panicking about the border now, wait a couple decades. Even with lots of people leaving them, the places that aren't through the demographic transition are going to see the biggest impacts of the remaining population growth. And this is the second thing I want to emphasize. Most population growth from now on will be in the poor countries, as you probably know. What I want to emphasize, which doesn't get as much play, is that it's mostly going to be in poor tropical countries. In 1950, 43% of the world's people lived in the tropics. By 2030, which is not far away, that's going to be 65%. And that means that over just the next 20 years, which I use because they're a lot easier to project than the next 40, about 75% of all the world's population growth will be in the tropics. Tropical populations will grow by about 40%, and the rest of the world will barely grow at all over the next 20 years. And this means that growth will be in areas that have, at least so far, been less successful in raising agricultural yields, either per acre or per labor day, than the temperate zone countries, and where at least some of the reasons for that problem are likely to continue or even intensify over the next few decades. For instance, unreliable and violently seasonal water supplies, quite common in the tropics, particularly because of the monsoon, may well be exacerbated by climate change. There are different models of how climate change is going to affect the monsoon, but you can make a pretty good case that seasonality will become more intense. And it's worth remembering that a large percentage of the historic increase in per acre yields, and especially the increases in farmer incomes, have come from extending the period of the year in which you can farm. In the northern latitudes, that was often done by finding cold-resistant crops so that you could extend the growing season that way. In the tropics, that's obviously not the problem, but the problem is year-round water supplies. Moreover, irrigated rice in particular, which is probably the best per acre provider of food of any crop humans have at this point, may actually have particularly serious problems in a changing climate, because it turns out that the high-yielding varieties benefit from cool evenings, and cool evenings are going to become harder to find. In China, for instance, over the last 25 years, the rice-growing areas have steadily migrated north. That's for a number of reasons, but one of them is that yields were flattening out in the warmest parts of the country. In the Philippines, on the experimental plots of the International Rice Research Institute, what they found is that basically 1 degree centigrade rise in the minimum temperature during growing season, so basically the nighttime temperature, reduced rice yields by 10%. In Thailand, where the data comes not from experimental crops, but from real, actual things, the data is a little spottier, but it seems to indicate that the relationship may be even stronger. So really serious warming is really going to hit the global rice crop. One of the things that means is that in the countries, again, in the tropics, where you will have the largest population growth, it will be hardest to meet that population growth by increasing yields per acre. And what that's going to do is maximize pressure to instead increase the number of acres, which means pressure on tropical forests, effects on the CO2 cycle, all sorts of things that should make us nervous. It also is going to mean greatly increased disaster vulnerability. both drought and flood, as more and more people farm areas that probably really shouldn't be farmed. And it's also a sobering thought that we've devoted surprisingly little research so far to appropriate technology for specifically tropical development. And this is not only true of agriculture, which is a thing that most obviously depends on climate, but other things as well. So for instance, it's only recently that people have begun measuring the methane emissions from the reservoirs behind big dams. When you seasonally fill and drain the reservoirs, you drown an awful lot of vegetation. Rotting vegetation gives off methane. At first we thought this was trivial. Turns out that in tropical settings it's huge. So in India, for instance, the percentage of the country's greenhouse emissions from dams actually exceeds the percentage of the country's energy that they supply. So what we thought was a CO2 reducing alternative to fossil fuels actually turns out to increase the CO2 levels. Yet dams remain a crucial part of most planners' toolkits, both for meeting energy demand without having to buy more oil on the world market, and also for managing seasonal and year-to-year fluctuations in water availability. They're also, big dams in the third world are a favorite of many first world businesses seeking to buy carbon credits to offset their own pollution by helping to build green projects elsewhere. And my point here is not that dams should be cut off our list of new technologies. There are mitigation strategies for these methane emissions, though they're expensive. But the more general point I wanted to make is that this is just another example of how technologies that we think we know the pluses and minuses of, from decades of experience with them in countries like the United States, Europe, Japan, which are industrialized, temperate zone places, may actually play out very, very differently in the parts of the world where most of the remaining population growth is going to be concentrated. So we're still a long way from figuring out what that remaining growth is going to mean, but we're going to learn a lot more by focusing on where the growth will be and on environmental specificities, like what it means to have certain things happen in the tropics in particular, than by just focusing, as we've tended to do over the last 50 years, on the gross number of how many people can the Earth support. So that sort of takes me through the first half of what I wanted to talk about, demography. So let me stop here. Let's discuss for a while, take questions, and then we'll start again with part 2, which is the China part.
To what extent have you seen like this growth in the tropical areas focusing at a coastal scale? Is it centralized around those areas?
It does tend to be. Obviously, an awful lot of the urban growth is coastal. The infrastructure is cheaper, and it does mean, you've probably seen this stuff, but if you look at the places that are vulnerable to sea level rise, it's just absolutely terrifying. And particularly terrifying because you're not only talking about places that are vulnerable, but places that are poor. They'll find the money to protect Manhattan and Amsterdam. A lot less clear for Dhaka and yeah, right. So yeah, that's another matter as well. I mean, there's a huge push both to coasts, but also to other vulnerable environments. So one of the things you see in India in particular is that just more and more people living closer and closer to the actual riverbank. And as we saw in Pakistan this summer, the water varies over the course of the year. And the closer you push people to the river, the more vulnerability you have. Same thing happening in the other direction in places where people are moving into areas where the water supply is desperately dependent on pumping. Right? So more and more attempts to try to farm very marginal land. Again, Pakistan, unfortunately, is a really good example. And parts of East Africa as well. And what happens there is often both disaster for the people, but also disaster for the land. That what was reasonably sustainable as grassland, if you overuse it, it doesn't go back to being grassland, it can go straight to desert. This is particularly true, again, the tropics are different. Most tropical soils, contrary to the sort of image we often have in our mind, the soils are actually quite poor in many cases, and the nutrients are in the layer of organic matter that falls from the trees, etc. It stays on top and is constantly replenished in a relatively rapid growth and decay cycle in hot, humid environments. What that means is that if you interrupt that cycle, as you do by, for instance, deforesting an area, the soil can really go to just garbage very, very quickly. There are parts of Vietnam, for instance, that still have not recovered from American defoliation efforts during the war. And that's not necessarily the chemicals, though in some cases it is. In many cases, it's simply that you interrupt that cycle by which that top layer of organic matter feeds plant growth. You've got crummy soil underneath, and before you know it, you've got either desert or this very, very tough savanna that basically just grows a grass that, so far at least, we don't have any use for.
That's kind of
Sure.
So, I understand why people are congregating within coastal areas, but why is there so much growth within tropical areas?
I mean, part of it is simply that these are areas where the social changes that tend to reduce birth rates have not happened to anything like the same extent. Right? I mean, they are poor areas where most jobs are in either agriculture or basic low-end manufacturing, for which there's no reason not to start work at 17. Right? There aren't any skills you're going to acquire between 17 and 25 that are really going to make a difference to your employability. That tends to lead to early marriage, et cetera, et cetera. They tend to be areas, often for reasons of poverty, though not always, where female education has been very poorly funded. And as I said, in a lot of places, not all places, female education has turned out to be one of the best mechanisms for bringing down birth rates without coercion. If you want to look at a place that in some ways is a very interesting and hopeful sign, the province of Kerala on the Indian coast is really interesting because it's still actually quite poor if you use per capita income as a measure. But in part because it's invested very heavily in public health and in education for women, they brought the birth rate down very, very dramatically. And in terms of things like life expectancy and literacy rates, they're actually doing really well on a pretty low per capita income. That doesn't necessarily mean that everybody's happy with that. But
on the fertility rate plot, you pointed out a steep decrease in China's rate sort of before the one-child policy really took hold.
Right.
Are there theories as to why that happened? And then when one-child policy took hold, the slope was pretty much the same as before. So what percentage of that slope was from the one-child policy versus whatever else was contributing before?
Yeah, the answer to the second part of your question is really easy. It's we don't know. The answer to the first part is there were a bunch of population, what shall we call it, encouragements to reduce your fertility in place before that. There were campaigns to encourage people to marry later, to encourage them to space their kids more. In some cases, this went along with actual financial incentives. In other cases, they went along with various kinds of sociological changes. So parents hoping their kid, urban parents in particular, hoping their kid actually wouldn't be in the factory, but would pass the university exams, so on and so forth. There's this, I mean, I hate the language of this, but there's this big discourse among economists about what they call the switch from emphasizing quantity to quality in children. I mean, the rhetoric is really unpleasant, but you kind of know what they're getting at. I mean, investing more in each kid rather than, and that tends to go along with a society that's changing in ways that you actually think the opportunities are there for the kid who gets educated or whatever. It also appears that, I mean, the China story is a little bit weird because the birth rate went extraordinarily high in the mid-50s and then again in the early 60s for China-specific reasons. And so in some ways it was so high that you had to expect it to come down. A little bit of that is artificial. But it's a good example of how we don't really know that much about what works. And you know, often policies that seemed very sensible didn't work. So, I mean, a good example, in the, I guess it was the late 50s, the Chinese government made it a law that every pharmacy had to provide condoms for free. And this seemed like a good way to get birth rates down. What they hadn't counted on was that it turned out that if you forced the pharmacists to provide them for free, they have no incentive to restock when they run out. And so actual availability shrank in a lot of places. And so what might have seemed like a retrogressive move, you know, go back to charging for them, turned out to be a really good idea. I don't want to imply that before the one-child policy there was no coercion at all. There clearly was in certain places. Cadres were under pressure to show that they were successfully bringing the birth rate down, and that leads to all sorts of unpleasant things. But it was nothing like the coercion of the early 80s, which is where, you know, the kind of horror stories that you've probably heard are real, but they're mostly early to mid-80s stories. Did you also?
You mentioned that population decline in peacetime hadn't really happened since the plague in the 17th century or something?
Yeah, I mean, there's a brief dip in the 17th century.
Yeah. So the current trend with the logistic curve believes that population will level off, right? Not necessarily decline.
Level off for a while, and then most projections are that it will actually start declining again.
Okay. Do those? I can understand how that would work in relation to ideas with how that population would affect global climate change, but do those models take into consideration like natural disasters as a source of declining population?
Most of them, no. I mean, in most cases, what natural disasters, it turns out, contrary to Malthus, most natural disasters, at least the ones we've seen in recorded history, actually aren't big enough to depress population very much. Because what tends to happen is that they kill the most vulnerable members of the population. They kill the elderly, and they kill the very young. And so as soon as the disaster is over, parents replace the young, and the elderly, I mean, again, this sounds wrong, but if you know what I mean, the elderly don't matter anyway. So disasters that really, really shift the population tend to either be wars or a handful of diseases, especially breath-borne diseases, that tend to hit people of all ages. And some of them, so for instance, a lot of the European diseases that killed off native populations in the New World appear to have been particularly devastating because what actually killed you was the overreaction of your immune system to this unfamiliar pathogen. And a disease that works that way tends to kill people whose immune systems are really robust, which tends to be people in their prime who are the ones who would be replacing the population. So we actually have relatively few cases of disaster being sufficient, so to speak, to really make a big difference. I mean, the plague is one exception. The Great Dying in the New World is another one. In certain parts of Africa, AIDS has been big enough to have a really significant effect. The 2 world wars, but surprisingly few others. Malthus got that part wrong. Now, what's going to drive, for the people who think we're headed for population decline, what really drives that story is just, the world looking more and more like Germany and Italy, where it's about 1.7 children per woman.
I don't know if this question makes sense or matters, but back to the population growth in the tropics, how much of it is starting from smaller towns that have existed for a long time and are just growing? And how much is it from like big projects that are brought in? Like when I think of deforestation in the Amazon, you're giving people access to a region they never had access to before, so that's all new development and new industry?
Those are very, very hard to disentangle. And so if millions of people are leaving villages in India to go to Delhi, for instance, on the one hand, they're obviously going to an existing city. On the other hand, if you looked at a micro level, you'd see new slum towns on the edge of Delhi. And to some extent, it's a matter of arbitrary census definitions, whether you want to say that's the growth of a new city or existing growth in it. Relatively little of the growth is the opening up of new natural resources. I mean, there are those examples like the Amazon or the outer islands of Indonesia, where you've had quite a bit of that. But for the most part, the big, that's actually something I guess I didn't talk about much, but the big growth of population is now urban. And so in those cases, you're not really talking about people moving to a place because of a concentration of natural resources. You're talking about people moving to places that suck in resources from other places. So.
Could I ask you about the migration? Just maybe a few more reasons of why, you're very sure that it's going to happen, but just maybe a few more reasons of why that might be the case.
My own argument would be that the numbers are pretty much irresistible, right? That it's, if you think about, the combination of huge income differentials, across, say, the US-Mexican border, probable continued drop from technology and costs of transportation, and then added to that, this demographic effect that, it's not just that Americans are richer than Mexicans, they're a lot older. I think that even given the power of many states, states here meaning governments, not states in the sense of Arizona, to restrict migration, they're A, going to find at some point they just probably can't, and B, that they're not even sure they want to, right? So if you look at a place, for instance, compare the United States, which has a pretty large flow of immigrants, right, to Western Europe, which has some but much lower than the United States. There are obviously some people in the United States who are unhappy with that flow of immigrants. On the other hand, if you want to ask what's going to keep Social Security from going bankrupt, right? It needs young people paying in. Take away immigration, right? And the American retirement system would be about to crash, the way it is in a place like France, where I was last week, and where government has just raised the retirement age, and there were big protests. Or if you think about just the number of older people who need various kinds of care. To the extent that what people need is manufactured goods, you can make them elsewhere and ship them in. But to the extent that people need services, the people actually have to be there. And I think that's going to leave a lot of governments and population, insofar as governments are democratic, populations that are divided on the issue of whether they really want to build huge walls to keep people out, because they're going to see reasons why they need them.
So, I mean, like, is that a pretty generally accepted view? Like, if that's the case, why do we have all these, these huge issues with the border?
Well, there are a lot of reasons. I mean, one is that, generally accepted among whom, right? Go to most university sociology or econ or whatever department, and you probably hear arguments sort of like the ones I just made. Mm-hmm. That doesn't necessarily mean that that resonates with an average voter, or necessarily with a politician who sees an opportunity to take advantage of the anxieties of an average voter. And they're, whether in the US or in the places in Europe where you're getting anti-immigrant issues and so forth, there are all kinds of bases for that anxiety. Some of them at least somewhat legitimate, some of them clearly paranoid. But for the person who believes, whether truly or not, that they lost their job to the competition for an immigrant, the argument that the society as a whole needs the immigration is probably not going to cut much ice with him or her. Okay, do people want to move on to part 2, or do people want to talk more about the demographic stuff? Okay, let's
Would you like a glass of water?
Yes, a glass of water would be great. Okay. What I want to do, China is in some ways a very odd topic, right? It isn't everywhere the way, say, the atmosphere is. And there's not an agreed upon methodology for studying it the way there is for studying, say, how much emissions you get from different kinds of transport systems. But China obviously does show up in discussions of sustainability in all sorts of different ways. As an example of various sorts of trends, as a case with lots of impact on the rest of the globe, and as both a positive and negative model. And it also happens to be what I know about. So what I think it makes most sense to do here is a very general introduction to a series of issues, stressing ways of thinking about China that may have applicability to other developing countries or impact on the world, rather than focusing on the unique aspects of the Chinese situation. And one of the things I want to emphasize, particularly in the first part of this section, is questions of measurement and significance, not by delving into the details of, say, how we measure GDP growth, which would bore you all to tears, but by emphasizing the degree to which measurements you choose and what scale you choose to look at, whether it's global, local, or national, will often influence the answers you get, and thus the need to really tailor your units very, very carefully to the questions that you want to address. For decades, China's significance in global and environmental terms was mostly tied to its large population. So we got books with titles like Who Will Feed China?, which which was just all about this image of, God, there are so many of them. More recently, though, the focus has shifted to the country's very rapid economic growth. And how to think about that, in turn, hinges partly on a guess about its uniqueness or lack thereof. Because one way to look at what China has done in the last 30 years or so is that it's a model for so-called third world development based on the mobilization of cheap labor that we're likely to see repeated elsewhere, since there are plenty of places that now have cheaper labor than China does. Or another possible way of looking at it is that far from being something that's going to be imitated, it's the last iteration of a resource-intensive style of industrialization that began in the West, and that just can't be repeated again on a global scale, on a large scale, because the planet has capacity for maybe one more time. And which of these ways you tend to frame the China story obviously has huge implications for which aspects of it you care about. And to think about that, I think it's worth pausing a moment just to ask what may seem like a dumb question, which is what we mean by economic development. Usually when we say economic development, what we mean is growth in income per capita. Basically, then, are we better off in material terms than earlier generations? And there are big problems with the conventional ways of measuring this, but let's put them aside for a moment. And if you don't worry too much about the details of the statistics, the answer is that almost every place in the world has a significantly higher per capita income than, say, 100 years ago, including most of the parts of the world we think of as desperately poor. And that's confirmed by data ranging from life expectancy, which is higher than 100 years ago everywhere except for a couple of war-torn countries like Afghanistan, and by certain common sense observations. Number of people who have electricity, running water, motor vehicles, phones, etc. So that's one measure of economic development by which there's been an awful lot of it in the 20th century. But sometimes people think of it in a different way, which is to say economic development is convergence towards the living standards of the richest countries. And by that criterion, there's actually been strikingly little progress in the last century. If you take the most widely used set of estimates for per capita income, and you assign the wealthiest large country in 1913, which was the US, an index number of 100, you can then give every other country a number based on what percentage of US per capita income it had. If you do that, and then you do the same thing again for 2007, what you find is that the number of countries whose index number has risen, and I don't mean caught up, just converged significantly towards the US, gone from, let's say, 25 to 45, it's remarkably few. And the few that have converged pretty much all fall into one of three categories. Either they're very small countries, mostly in the Persian Gulf, and we know what that story is, or they're countries on the edge of Europe, so Scandinavia on the one hand, Portugal and Spain, Greece on the other. Or the third group is in East Asia, Japan, Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and if it were a separate country, Eastern China, which has more population than all the other groups put together. So if you think that development, living standards, etc., have to be evaluated not just in absolute terms, but in terms of people's relative deprivation or relative sense of power or lack thereof, then the Chinese case really does stand out. I mean, it's a real outlier. Or at least the East China case does. China as a whole is a little bit more complicated. Even China as a whole stands out in another important way, which is related to absolute and not just relative gains. if you take World Bank poverty estimates from just before the 2008 crash, which again are problematic and probably underestimate global poverty in various ways, but they're the best numbers we have. According to those numbers, the world had 350 million fewer poor people in 2008 than in 1980. China, according to that same data, had reduced its number of poor people by 340 million. Now, the world had added 2 billion people in those years, so it's not as if there weren't also people exiting poverty elsewhere in the world. But still, to a first approximation, the net global reduction in poverty over the last 30 years is China. So, how has that happened? Where is it going? And what does it mean for sustainability? Okay, the Chinese economy has grown at 8 to 9% per capita from 1980 till now, which, through the magic of compounding, gives you 1,100% cumulative per capita growth. The only other country that has ever come close to that growth rate over a 30-year period is South Korea, which is obviously much, much smaller. And the number is somewhat inflated by certain things, and there are reasons why it's bound to fall over the next decade or two, in part because the population is aging and the percentage of people in the workforce will shrink. But nonetheless, the growth rate is still truly unusual in global terms. So, is this environmentally sustainable, and how much environmental damage has already been done? One measure that it's already very bad is that in 2004, the Chinese Ministry of Environmental Protection implemented a pilot program to calculate what's sometimes called green GDP. In other words, growth with deductions made for damage to the environment. And they did this just for a few provinces. And they didn't do it for long. The rumor has it that the figures were so bad, and in fact that they were negative for various places, that the government quickly decided this was going to make too many people look bad and simply scrapped the experiment. We do know that the program was shelved. Within China, there's a lot of debate about whether or not the country can follow what is generally perceived as being the path that the West and Japan took, which you might summarize as first get rich, then worry about cleaning up. And while it's hard to tell, it seems pretty clear that at least among educated people, the gathering consensus is that that's simply not viable for China, which is probably a good thing for the rest of us, that that is the gathering consensus. But what have the actual impacts been? Which ones are either controllable or reversible? Let me just talk about a few of them. Air pollution is extremely bad. About 1% of urban residents in China breathe air that consistently meets safety standards. And the levels of particulate matter, sulfur dioxide, and various other things are anywhere from 3 to 12 times what they are in New York or LA. So if you don't like the air here, stay out of Taiyuan. By measures of the American EPA, 9 of the 10 major world cities with the worst air are in China. But it's probably also here in the area of air pollution that there's the most hope that wealth will actually bring cleanup, because we actually know what to do. Technology like scrubbers that make a huge difference exist. They just happen to be expensive. Sulfur dioxide emissions in Beijing, for instance, peaked in 2005, and they've declined about 20% since then. Interestingly, Beijing's peak in 2005 was at almost exactly the same level of Tokyo's peak in 1970. And the air in Tokyo today has about only a quarter as much sulfur dioxide as 40 years ago. So this is an area in which, if you have the money to invest, good stuff can happen. Nationwide, most forms of air pollution in China seem to have peaked in 2007. So we may have seen the worst. So there's definitely improvement going on, largely driven by the adoption of better equipment as people become more prosperous and more health conscious, as the equipment gets more affordable, and as enforcement gets better. And if the experience of early industrializers is a guide, the speed of this improvement will actually pick up over the next decade or so. So that's a relatively positive story. But it should be said that not all of this improvement will come from better scrubbers, et cetera, et cetera. It's equally likely that a lot of it will come because industrial pollution will simply leave China for other places as environmental standards get enforced more. And that sort of thing has tended to be bad for the world as a whole. When a lot of the steel industry left Japan for China in the 90s, for instance, it went to a place where the technology was lower and the amount of energy, water, etc., used per ton of production was a lot higher. Chinese CO2 emissions per ton of steel, for instance, are about 75% above the global average. Though there are reasons to discount that a little bit. They are coming down fast as the old plants are retired, but how fast remains open to question. Water usage per ton of output is about twice as high as the Chinese steel industry is in the American one. Though interestingly, the best Chinese steel plants match the American standards. And if you want to put China in global perspective, in India, there are steel plants that are anywhere from 2 to 8 times, used anywhere from 2 to 8 times as much water per ton as the United States. So yes, there are producers waiting behind China. If the Chinese start enforcing their environmental standards more, some of the production will just go to places that are even dirtier. This question of production moving from areas with tighter pollution controls to weaker ones raises some of the ways in which China's environmental problems need to be related to its role in globalization over the last 20 years or so. A study done at Carnegie Mellon a couple years ago suggested that about 1/3 of China's greenhouse gas emissions in 2005 came from the export sector. The export sector generates about 10% of net GDP. So that's an awful lot of junk producing stuff. That's mostly for the rest of us. An extreme example of this, but a relevant one, is what is now an enormous global trade in waste, which is driven by the combination of Chinese resource hunger, a lax regulatory system, and the enormous amounts of junk generated elsewhere from which some resources can be harvested, though often in dirty and risky ways. If you want to see a truly heartbreaking set of films, I show these to my undergraduates, but I don't have time here. A series of just short 10-minute clips. It's a BBC documentary about towns in South China that recycle computers, and there are just enormous levels of toxicity there. And in fact, for the US, scrap for recycling is now our biggest export to China. And this varies from relatively benign stuff like cardboard to the really nasty stuff like e-waste. The US discards 50 million computers and 100 million cell phones a year. And as of 2008, the EPA had no idea where 80% of that waste went. And good chance that an awful lot of it winds up in China and other third world countries where these standards are low. Another recent study estimated that if you took the amount of pollution in China that was generated producing goods that were ultimately consumed in Great Britain, then Great Britain's 18% reduction in carbon emissions over the last 20 years turns into a 20% increase. So there are a lot of linkages here that mean that how we count really matters, right? Do you attribute pollution to the place where it's produced, or to the place that the good that is being produced ultimately gets consumed, so on and so forth. At any rate, what all this shows is that helping China green its economy is a big deal. And lots of foreigners are involved in this, though how much help they are varies. As a lot of you probably know, the Kyoto Protocol established something called the Clean Development Mechanism, through which those in richer countries can offset their own carbon emissions by paying for projects which reduce emissions elsewhere in the world. Over 80% of all the Clean Development Mechanism emissions credits that were purchased in the year 2008 were for projects in China. Somewhat inflated by the fact that 2008 was such a terrible economic year in many parts of the world, but still, that's a very, very big number. So on the one hand, the world is allowing a lot of other emissions in order to try and get China's down. On the other hand, that means that we're relying very heavily on the trustworthiness of Chinese data to make emissions trading work, which is not always a safe thing. I mean, estimating these things can be very hard to begin with, because you're only supposed to get credits for pollution-reducing moves that would not have happened without your investment. And that can be very hard to know. But it's also true that lots of folks have incentives to play fast and loose with the data, or allow others to do so. A Chinese town that would like to get a scrubber for the smokestack of its power plant has an incentive to exaggerate how much this is going to reduce emissions, because then somebody in Europe gets a credit for it, and bingo. For the special case of carbon dioxide, China's emissions continue to rise, even though the carbon efficiency of the economy is improving and the rate of increase in emissions has slowed. China has committed to reducing its CO2 per dollar of GDP to a bit over half 2005 levels by 2020, which sounds pretty good at first, until you calculate that given the estimated likely growth of the economy, that still means about a 60% growth in total emissions. Some estimates say that China has to level off in CO2 emissions by 2020 for the world to avoid catastrophic levels of carbon in the atmosphere by 2050. I sure hope that's not true, because it's not going to happen. You might see a leveling off by 2030, but in those extra 10 years, the level at which that leveling off occurs will have gotten much higher. China is making a major push in solar and wind. It's now the world's largest producer of solar panels, catching up fast in wind turbines. There are huge plans, for instance, to install enormous amounts of solar panels in the Gobi Desert, things like that. And it's also pushing very hard on electric cars. There is some good stuff happening. But in the meantime, it built an enormous number of coal-fired plants from 2003 to 2008. In fact, basically, well, let's just leave it at an enormous amount. And having built them, it presumably plans to use them. Historically, the average life of one of these plants is about 50 years. So once you've built it, figure it's going to be belching stuff for the rest of our lives. China is also banking very heavily on hydropower to achieve some emissions reductions. And this is a plan that goes together with other water management goals. It already has the most large dams in the world, about 85,000. But today it has the engineering, infrastructure, and financial capacity to exploit some high-value, high-risk sites that it had previously left untouched, particularly in the Himalayas. I'm going to show you two maps, and what you need to bear in mind as you look at these maps is in some ways fairly obvious fact, which is water has the greatest potential to generate electricity when it's high up, right? Because it's the amount that it dives into the turbine that gives you the power. So, since China's major rivers start in the Himalayas in the far west, if you were building simply to maximize electric power, you'd build all your dams in the west. Well, here are major dams built before '87. I think you can clearly see that other factors are trumping the engineering criteria. Now, here are the things that have gone on the books since '87. There's Tibet. That's the triumph of engineering criteria. And this is hugely controversial. The World Bank, for instance, tends to really like this. The way they estimate the environmental safety of a dam is a very simple algorithm in which basically you divide the amount of power to be generated by the number of people who will be displaced by the dam. And so, since building in the Himalayas gives you huge amounts of potential power and relatively few people displaced because it's sparsely populated, you get really, really good numbers when you plan to build in the Himalayas. But there are obviously other factors at work.
Wait, that's the only criteria the World Bank has for
That's what
dams?
that's what
That's the main
essentially
one?
that's essentially what drives the formula. It's not the only thing.
Right. That
But
makes me
you know, if you sort of go through the numbers, you will find that that more than anything else drives the calculation. But you know, there are huge risks to biodiversity when you go through a very, very steep vertical decline. You go through lots of microclimates very fast. Yunnan province down here has, by some measures, as many species as North America. There are also huge potential impacts of these things on downstream agriculture. The timing of water storage to fill the reservoir and then release to drain it can lead to, for instance, saline invasion down in the delta. If water isn't coming downstream at the right, fresh water isn't coming downstream at the usual times, salt water moves in. It can also lead to water shortage at crucial times of the year. The big issue here for a lot of these dams is that because of the timing of the South Asian monsoon, so on, for instance, the Lansang River here, which goes into Vietnam and becomes the Mekong. Early spring, before the monsoon has started, is a key planting time, and you need water. But it's also a key time way upstream, where because the rains haven't come yet, you can't run the turbines unless you hold back some of the water in your dam. So you've got serious potential conflicts there. There are also big threats to downstream fishing. And this is, again, particularly a big issue for the Mekong. As you can see, the blue dots are dams that are already operational. Green is under construction, yellow is planned. This is the Chinese border. Down here in the delta, you have the world's richest inland fishery, accounting for, among other things, about 80% of Cambodia's protein supply and half of Vietnam's export earnings from fishing. And again, the timing of water release is crucial. The fish have evolved in many cases to know when to spawn based on water levels in the river. If you start changing that, you can really, really screw them up. So very, very serious potential impacts. But at the moment, it's not clear what the alternatives to those dams are, except burning even more fossil fuels. And so the Chinese answer to skepticism tends to be, hey, tell us what else we're supposed to do. And the other thing I would emphasize is that 9 of Asia's 10 largest rivers happen to start on the Chinese side of the border in Tibet. The only exception is the Ganges. The fact that China is upriver, that it now has a first world engineering capacity, so it doesn't need technical assistance to build, and that it's now sitting on a lot of foreign exchange, so it doesn't necessarily need financial participation from, say, the World Bank, means that they are very, very much in the driver's seat on all these international waterways. And it's how that works out is going to be really critical. And it's complicated by the fact that for the Chinese themselves, probably the most dire environmental worries these days involve water. China as a whole has about 1/4 of the world's average water supply per capita. The North China Plain in particular, which is a major agricultural region, has about 1/20th of the world's average per capita water supply. North China had been a food deficit area for centuries and essentially had been subsidized by the South in various ways. After 1949, the government put massive amounts of effort into irrigating the north, both with dams for surface water, but even more with tube wells. Shandong province in the north, for instance, went from being 3% irrigated in 1949 to 70% irrigated by 1980. In agricultural terms, the result was spectacular. This very poor area became a breadbasket, even though the population was soaring. But the groundwater withdrawals that this was based on, the amount you were taking out of the aquifers, was about 4 times sustainable levels. And surface water is also being overused. The Yellow River now reaches the ocean only about 1/3 of the year. And the water table under the North China Plain is dropping by about 1 meter, 1.5 meters per year. If you think about this problem technologically, ignoring social and political complications for a minute, it's clear that there are some ways available to restrain or reduce water demand without actually reducing output and living standards very much. Ironically, some of the really high-tech things we use to save water here probably wouldn't work in North China for various reasons. But there are a lot of very basic stuff that's not being done. Lining irrigation ditches, better maintenance of leaky pipes and faucets, stuff that certainly is not rocket science by anybody's. Basic treatment of wastewater that would allow more of it to be reused and so on. And there has been significant progress. While it's hard to get good data, it looks as if water usage in agriculture has declined about 20% since the late 80s, with no decline in agricultural yields. This is good. Overall use in China as a whole is still up a bit, but given what a dominant user of water agriculture is, that's where the big savings have to come from. And so the downward trend in agricultural water use is a really good sign. And this performance contrasts very sharply with, for instance, India, where agricultural water use continues to rise despite comparably serious signs of unsustainability. So in some ways, the Chinese look at what they're doing and they say, hey, we're not doing badly. But this is just, if you will pardon the expression, treading water. And doing better is going to require making sure that implementation happens and that it keeps happening at the local level. In other words, that people fix those leaky faucets and then they keep them fixed. And that's actually very difficult. We have a tendency to think of China as a highly centralized state. And this is the first thing I try to tell American audiences. Get that out of your head. Yes, it's authoritarian, but no, it is not highly centralized. A huge amount of political power is concentrated at the provincial and especially the local levels. And most local governments are very, very dependent on land leasing deals with local developers to stay afloat financially. The reason for this would make your eyes glaze over, but trust me. Consequently, these local governments tend to look the other way when these local developers pollute. And the central government, though it actually has some pretty good legislation on the books, doesn't have the resources to do the enforcement itself. The Ministry of Environmental Protection has 300 direct employees at the central level. The EPA has 9,000. So that gives you a kind of rough. There are 2,400 local environmental protection offices, but they're controlled by the local governments, not by the center, and they are often much more oriented towards collecting fees than towards making the infractions stop. So their goal is not to set fines at a level that would deter the behavior. Their goal is to set fines at a level that enable the local government to share the profits from polluting. If you can't make people do what you want by directly policing them, right, by being there and saying, no, 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 this is against the law, one of the more effective alternatives is to make it worth their while, which in this case would mean letting water prices rise to a level where people would find it financially advantageous to fix those leaks, to recycle water, and so on. And there have been some significant water price increases, both rural and urban. But doing enough of this to solve the shortages would be extremely difficult without interfering with other priorities, and it would hit the poor hardest. If you raised water prices enough to really matter, a fair amount of marginal farming in China would probably just stop. It wouldn't be worth it anymore, especially the winter wheat crop in the north. So grain imports would have to rise. Now, this isn't a problem financially. China has plenty of currency reserves. But still, there are issues involved with that, and the problems are political and social. On the one hand, the Chinese government, for security reasons, has tried to keep grain imports to no more than 5% of consumption. Good for national security, bad for the environment. You lose out on a lot of virtual water that way. And consumers elsewhere in the world are probably just as happy for China not to be importing more and pushing up global grain prices. So it wouldn't just be the poor in China who would suffer, it would be the poor in places like sub-Saharan Africa. More importantly, though, from a Chinese perspective, any sharp rise in water prices would worsen the economic gap between farmers and the rest of society, and that's already a very big gap. The regime has placed a very high value on keeping the pace of urbanization from getting too rapid. They don't want to have Manila or Mexico City style slums. And they're having a lot of trouble keeping the movement to the cities from overwhelming them. There are now about between 15 and 20 million net migrants per year to Chinese cities. Over the next 20 years, urban population in China will rise by about 500 million. So, by the US plus Brazil, more or less. There are more and more in the countryside of what people call 386170 villages. 38 is International Women's Day. 61 is International Children's Day. And 70 means 70. So these are villages where the young men are gone. You have children. You have some women, and you have the elderly, often raising the kids. If you want to see a really good but depressing movie, I strongly recommend this new film called Last Train Home, about Chinese migrants in the cities and the kids they've left behind. But at any rate, given all of this, the government is very, very reluctant to make the migrant migration go even faster, which is what would happen if you raised water prices enough to shut off water waste in the countryside. So they don't really want to do that. And given the difficulties in solving the problem that way, right, by restraining demand, the temptation is, of course, to instead try to find some way to increase supply. Some of what they're doing here is clearly one-shot stuff. So the government, for instance, is now building huge reservoirs in parts of northwestern China to catch water from melting glaciers. And it's not clear how much of that they plan to store long-term, how much they just plan to use it, and then when the glaciers are gone, they're gone. But it sort of looks like they're planning the latter, which is pretty scary stuff. They are also a few years into what is going to be the largest construction project in human history, which is what's called the South-North Water Diversion. 3 enormous tunnels from the Yangtze Valley to the Yellow River Valley to bring water from south to north, to bring, to be precise, about 47 billion cubic meters of water per year. That's, I think, about 11 trillion gallons per year from the Yangtze Valley to the north. Another way to think of that is the amount of water they plan to move every year is about 3 times the flow of the Colorado River through these tunnels. The first prong, which is the easiest in the east, is already operational. The second prong is underway, though it's a little behind schedule. But the really big story is the western prong. It's the most difficult, it's the scariest in terms of environmental risk, and some people think it simply shouldn't be built, but it is in the next 5-year plan. And since it's not clear that the Yangtze actually has that much water to give, there is also talk of diverting water from another river, the Yaolong-Tsangpo. I mentioned before that most of Asia's big rivers start in Tibet. Well, here are a bunch of them. This is the Yaolong-Tsangpo. This is the place where they're now building a massive dam on it. And this is another part of the Yaolong-Tsangpo, which goes by the name of the Brahmaputra. It is the principal water source for a large portion of eastern India and Bangladesh. At the moment, well, about a year and a half ago, the Chinese started building the world's largest hydro dam right here at the Great Bend on the Yaolong-Tsangpo. They insist that they have no intentions of diverting the water, that they're simply going to run it through the turbines and let it continue down. Even that, however, has some problems. And more to the point, up until about January of 2009, they completely denied that they had any intentions of building a dam there. And it wasn't until satellite photos showed that the dam was already underway, and people said, what's going on here, that they admitted, well, yes, there's a dam here, and it's going to be the largest in the world. In fact, roughly twice the size of Three Gorges, which is currently the largest dam in the world. If they actually do, as some people think, undertake a water diversion there, the consequences for South Asia are absolutely catastrophic. And this would be a perfect example of a non-sustainable, passing the buck kind of approach to development. If, on the other hand, Chinese can find a way to phase in some demand-side restraint before it's too late, buy some time until they're past their population peak, and able to afford better technologies, perhaps with a little help from overseas price breaks, then they just might make their development sustainable after all. And if they can do that, that would be a huge, huge thing, since, as I pointed out at the beginning, the scale of their development and the success they've had in lifting people out of poverty really has virtually no parallel in the modern world. So if somehow they can avoid having it have truly catastrophic impacts on their neighbors, this is going to be an extraordinary achievement. But right now, it's a pretty dicey thing. Okay, let me stop there. Probably gone on too long as it is, but we still have some time for questions and discussion. Haven't put everybody to sleep, have I?
When China plans their various dams, is there any communication with the downstream countries? And if so, how does that communication happen? Like, I know the Mekong River Commission exists to help some of the Mekong River countries communicate, but China's not part of that. So
China and Burma are both not members of the Mekong River Commission, which ironically is partly a result of the United States in the 50s trying to isolate China. Now it comes back to haunt everybody. The Chinese are beginning to conclude data sharing agreements with other countries on water. So for instance, on the Yarlung Tsangpo Brahmaputra, they now share flood season data on a real-time basis with the Indian government. Why it's only flood season, I don't know, since actually drought season data would be just as important. One can hope that that's the beginnings of various kinds of confidence and building measures that would really matter. But so far, transparency is not a real strength of this regime. And downstream countries have had a huge amount of trouble figuring out what the Chinese intend, which exacerbates a classic tragedy of the commons. Right? So if you take the Mekong, for instance, right? If you were God looking down and you could plan things the way you wanted and make everybody obey you, what you would say is, if I'm going to build dams on the Mekong, I would build them upstream in Chinese territory where the payoff is greatest, where the effect on the fish population for various reasons is the least, and then I would make the Chinese share the benefits with the people downstream. Not being God, we can't make that happen. So what then happens is Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam look upstream and say, if they're going to do this anyway, why should we be restrained? Right? If we're going to lose a lot of the fishing, for instance, anyway, we may as well build a dam in our territory and get the power. And so you get this, tragedy of the commons, this, hey, if the resource is going to be wrecked anyway, I may as well be the one to wreck it and benefit. Same thing is happening. There are a whole bunch of projects planned along the Brahmaputra, where again, one of the things that seems to be going on is India is thinking, hey, if the Chinese may wreck this thing anyway, let's get our piece first. So communication has been a serious problem. The one place I can think of at the moment that's an oddly hopeful exception is the Amur River along the Russian-Chinese border, where there have actually been really significant steps towards a cooperative plan for development. Why that one should be working better than the others, I can't tell you.
It seems so absurd to build dams downstream when you don't know what the upstream flows are going to be like.
It does indeed, but it wouldn't be the first time. I mean, if you want a real irony, one of the very few international water sharing agreements that so far has worked pretty well, in fact, the one that the World Bank always points to as the example of how these things could work, is of all things the India-Pakistan agreement on the Indus, which, those are not two countries that you would pick if you were going to bet on name the two countries that have successfully cooperated. Part of that is actually an engineering story, that they very cleverly designed the agreements that it required very little actual day-to-day cooperation. Part of it is also that up until recently, there was plenty of water for both sides. And in fact, now that there isn't any more, they're worried about this falling apart. But the other possibility that some people have raised is that the reason that they've probably cooperated relatively well is that it's such a crucial waterway for both countries, but especially for Pakistan, that to violate the agreement would be almost like going nuclear. And so it's a sort of mutually assured destruction kind of thing. But at any rate, there are some international water sharing agreements that have worked, but depressingly few. And the Chinese nationalists are no fools, right? So, when they want to get, say, Americans to back off and not raise a fuss about what they're doing on the Mekong, they say, yeah, and what exactly have you done to the Colorado, and how much of it flows through to Mexico? Right? And if you're an American, you start shuffling your feet guiltily. And, other questions? The water thing is really huge, and at least to me, very scary. But, yeah, and what's frustrating there is you can clearly see that there are technical fixes that would work. The question is how you get the social and political variables lined up so that you can implement the technical fixes without really hurting the most vulnerable people in the society.
Could you maybe mention how that south-north water division works again?
Well, it's a series of 3 enormous tunnels. This one goes from the lower Yangtze region to the Beijing-Tianjin area. And this actually mostly uses an existing canal. And it's mostly flat terrain, which is why they've been able to do this one fairly easily. This one would go from the middle Yangtze, again up to the North China Plain. And the big and kind of amazing ones would be from the far west. And what you can't see on this map, that you just have to imagine, is you're tunneling through the foothills of the Himalayas here. I mean, this is, among other things, the seismic risk is enormous. But the idea is basically that most of this North China region barely gets enough water for agriculture, and yet it's become the country's breadbasket through irrigation. So as you start pumping out the aquifers, what do? Either, again, you find some way for more efficient management on the demand side, which is what we'd all like to see. But if you're not sure you can pull that off, you think about supply, and the theory has always been that the Yangtze has plenty of water, and you can take billions and billions of gallons. Oh, I forgot to do the map of, I'm sorry, I had a map of Chinese water supply by region, and I think I forgot to put the link in. I can send it to anybody who wants to see it. The idea was you can move the water through these tunnels. It takes a certain amount of power. Water is heavy, but you're also generating power as you move the water down out of the Himalayan foothills. So it's, in power terms, it's probably a wash. And the idea is it would flow into, particularly the western course. Basically what you'd be doing is the water would flow into the bed of the Yellow River, and you'd replenish this dying river. What scares lots and lots of people is that it's not at all clear that the numbers add up. It's not clear that the Yangtze can actually spare 47 billion cubic meters of water per year without itself going dry. And if that's the case, then you start thinking about, well, where else could you get the water? And well, you could get it from all these nice rivers that from the Chinese point of view are, quote, wasted because they go off to be the Indus, the Brahmaputra, the Mekong, the Salween. As I said, 9 out of Asia's 10 largest rivers start on the Chinese side of the border in Tibet. the temptation to do some kind of diversion, once you've got the technical capacity to do it, is very large.
How much existing agriculture is there, if any, in South China?
Oh, there's quite a bit.
So that
but
you're dealing with virtual water trays instead of...
There is, let me get a decent map of China back. Just use these, doesn't really matter. There is a lot of agriculture in the south as well, but it's declining partly simply because this is, the industrial heartland is now really from Shanghai all the way down the coast towards Guangdong, Hong Kong. And both because the water is now being used for other things and because it's becoming, in many cases, intensely polluted, agriculture has tended to retreat in the south, which is not to say it's not there, but more and more agriculture in the north, and especially the northeast, and this is actually so far a big success story, is that they've developed cold-resistant varieties of both rice and wheat that have been growing quite nicely up in Manchuria. So far so good. But all of that is heavily dependent on irrigation. Basically, the East Asian monsoon in a typical year blows up out of the South China Sea, and this is about as far north as it gets. So it drops a huge wall of water on everything behind this curve that I'm now drawing. And beyond that, you're in the rain shadow and you get a little bit of water. But, so Shandong up here gets something on the order of 20 inches of rain a year, which is about what Tel Aviv gets. But it's become a major agricultural breadbasket, both through pumping out the aquifers and through just unbelievable amounts of fertilizer use. So actually water recycling is another big issue. If you could get localities to meet the water treatment standards that in theory already exist, you could actually reuse an awful lot of water and say that enforcement is just pathetic in a lot of these places.
Could I ask you back on that enforcement question? Is
Yeah.
it because the companies that are working with, so I guess the more local companies, you said are managed by the local governments, do they not have the money to do a lot, like say the wastewater treatment?
In some cases they could.
Okay.
What you've got is, well, real quick and dirty history. When the Chinese government decided that they really wanted to make a major economic development push in the late 70s, they looked around at the people in local government. And over half of local cadres at that point were people who had joined the party during the Cultural Revolution. These were not the most promising people to lead the development push. And you had to somehow buy them off. And part of the way you did that is through a tax structure that basically said, localities are not allowed to tax agriculture, but they do get to keep a very large percentage of any revenue generated by local industry. So that meant that if you were a local cadre, it was industrialize or die. But if you did industrialize, suddenly there was all this revenue for you. And that was a source of patronage and a way for people who were, right? I mean, you were trying, in a sense, to buy off a local ruling class. You were going to say, we're going to take away a lot of your power to order people around. How do you get people to accept that without violence? You've got to give them something else. Part of what they gave them is, we're going to let you control all this revenue, which means that you can buy people off now that you can't order them around. And the genius of it was that it worked. And you managed to reorient local government towards an economic development strategy and to peacefully give up a lot of their power to coerce people. Certainly not all, but a lot. The cost was, of course, that you created a very tight marriage between local government and these firms, some of them private, some of them public, that drive the economic development. And if you're in local government and a huge percentage of your revenue comes from that chemical plant, you never want to actually make that chemical plant do anything that might cause it to cut back production. Yeah, so again, you set the fines at a level that enable you to share the profits, but you never set them high enough that they say, gee, it's not worth doing this anymore, or let's reopen somewhere else. So in many, many cases, local government is very tightly tied to these local development interests. And just, also, I mean, let's remember, much of China is still very poor, and in a country that's very poor, jobs, jobs, jobs is a pretty persuasive slogan to a lot of people.